Well, good morning and welcome to our Thursday morning Alabama Decorative Arts Symposium. Again, we're glad you're back. We're glad you could join us this morning, and I would like again to thank the Alabama State Council on the Arts for our continued support of these lectures, as well as our pop-up exhibit called Plain and Simple, Fine and Fancy. It's a survey of Alabama Decorative Arts on exhibit at the Crest Building here in Montgomery on downtown historic Dexter Avenue. Next week's presentation will be Seeing Double, Stereo Optic Views of Alabama with Michael McCurchin. Next Thursday morning, same time, May the 13th at 10 o'clock. But today our presenter is going to be Dr. Anne Forschler-Tarrasch. She joined the Birmingham Museum of Art in 1999 as the Marguerite Jones Harbert and John Harbert III Curator of Decorative Arts at the Birmingham Museum of Art, and she's now the chief curator since 2013. At the Birmingham Museum of Art, Anne oversees the care, the display, and the interpretation of over 16,000 objects. That's pretty mind-boggling to me, including the famous Wedgwood collection. She's curated a number of exhibitions at the museum and reinstalled several galleries through the years, and she's contributed to a large amount of museum publications and scholarly journals as well. So without further ado, please take it over for us. A noble cause, a sublime effort, a brief history of the Confederate gunboat quilts. Good morning.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for including me in your program today. I'm excited. I'm learning a lot about the organization. It's nice to meet everyone. You're not too far away from Birmingham, so I hope to see you down in Montgomery at some time soon. But quilts are such a fascinating subject, and they tell such interesting stories, and the South has such a rich history in quilt making. The Birmingham Museum of Art's collection of more than 500 Southern quilts still has a lot of opportunity or offers a lot of opportunity for new discoveries. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the history and the context of one particular quilt, and this is the so-called gunboat quilt. Get my slides going. So imagine that it's around 1860. And the location is the Deep South. At the time, life was largely rural and agricultural. And in fact, let me get my slides going. The Southern Gulf states like Alabama formed a significant part of the so-called Cotton Belt, an agricultural region where cotton was an important and primary cash crop. Indeed, by 1860, cotton had become the United States' most valuable export. And ports like Galveston, New Orleans, Mobile, and Apalachicola in Florida exported vast amounts of cotton. And through these ports, the young nation established successful commercial relationships with the rest of the world. So if you were a white Southern man during this time, you likely owned a farm or plantation, and you oversaw workers who grew your crops, such as cotton. If you were a white woman, you worked in the home and you raised the children. And if you were Black, you were enslaved and you did most of the work in the fields or in the home. So cotton and slavery grew together. And this is one of my favorite, just as an aside, paintings in the Birmingham's collection, made in the 20th century, but showing cotton pickers in the South. So cotton and slavery grew together, becoming more important and intertwined as the 19th century progressed, and ultimately more valuable as cotton provided the fuel for the US economy and inextricably linked the South with the North, and provided the driving force for westward expansion. By 1860, the value of all enslaved people was more than the value of all the farmland in the slaveholding states. However, for all the wealth that grew from cotton and slavery, the nation continued to struggle over the morality and ethics of the slave society. The struggle came to a head during November 1860, the presidential election. The newly formed Republican Party opposed slavery's expansion into Western federal territories and the Democratic Party was split and consequently held differing views about if and where slavery should exist. Neither party wanted to totally abolish slavery in the South, at least not originally. Nonetheless, news of Republican Abraham Lincoln's presidential victory triggered calls for secession in the South, and the Gulf Coast states, along with their slaveholding neighbors, felt that this was their only option to protect their livelihoods and their power. Yet the decision to secede from the Union led the nation down a path toward civil war. Mississippi seceded on January 9th, 1861, followed by Florida on January 10th, Alabama on January 11th, Louisiana on January 26th, and Texas on February 1st. On February 4th, the Confederate States government was formed in Montgomery. War was imminent, and while the Gulf states were initially safe from large Union armies marching in on foot, they were not safe from the Union Navy, which moved quickly into the Gulf. The Navy transported supplies, provided reinforcements for Union battalions, and traveled further south than land forces were able. The presence of Confederate forces and Union forces in the Gulf led to a series of clashes early in the war, but Union success increased in January of 1862 when the naval blockade of the US southern coast, part of the Anaconda Plan, was put in place, allowing US forces, and here we see ports, the Union blockade, and this blockade allowed Union forces to attack southern ports with devastating effects. New Orleans surrendered on April 25th of that year, giving Union control of the lower Mississippi River. They had already taken control of the upper Mississippi River. And by then, the Union Navy had positioned ships off of every important Confederate port, blocking those points of entry for shipments of foreign goods that were critical for survival during the Union embargo. In contrast, the Confederate Navy was smaller and weaker, but intently focused on protecting Confederate coastlines and harbors from invasion. Because the Confederate Navy could never compete in size compared to the Union Navy, it began to focus on new technologies in defensive weapons, including the gunboat, or so-called ironclad. Convinced that this type of vessel could protect southern ports like Mobile and ultimately lead to victory for the Confederates. And here we see a gunboat in the Mississippi River. They patrolled throughout the Mississippi River, attacking homes and forts along the river all through the South. But this is essentially what a gunboat looks like. For the Confederacy, the first of these odd-looking and unwieldy crafts, the CSS Virginia, was launched on March 8, 1862. Here we see the Virginia. And this gunboat was built from the burned remains of the steam frigate USS Merrimack, which had been sunk by the Union Navy in the Norfolk Navy Yard to avoid capture. The Virginia sported iron armor, inclined walls to deflect cannonballs, and 10 guns thrust through her walls. Both her bow and stern were below the waterline, with only her casement visible from above. From her bow protruded a 1,500-pound cast iron ram. And the Virginia was celebrated for her success in battle against the Union fleet in the bay at Hampton Roads, Virginia. And from there, word spread that at last the Confederacy possessed a weapon which would, quote, drive from our waters the whole blockading fleet. And although this battle in Virginia did not result in a reversal of the blockade, many Southerners believed that one or two ironclads or gunboats could free a Southern port. The Confederate government sanctioned the building of new gunboats, and women across the South quickly joined the ironclad gunboat crusade. And this is where our story begins. Historically, women have played a major role in war efforts, primarily, at least through the late 20th century, on the home front, making necessary supplies, providing food, nursing the wounded. And during the American Civil War, a number of ladies' aid societies were organized in both the South and the North, which gathered goods and money used to support frontline soldiers and volunteers. And through these groups, women provided blankets and clothing, stitched uniforms and other apparel, and collected and distributed hospital supplies to the wounded. Fairs and raffles were organized to raise money. And here we see a raffle in St. Louis in 1864, and I could not find an image of a Southern fair or raffle. But these fairs and raffles were organized to raise money, and women were called upon to sew or knit objects to donate and sell. In Alabama, women gathered to lay plans to provide clothing for Confederate soldiers. And within weeks, aid societies sprang up in every county in the state until by January 1st, 1862, there were over 100 organizations weaving, sewing, and knitting. And church leaders often took an active part in stimulating such organizations, offering women space to work and grounds for fairs and bazaars such as this one. Alabama women were also quick to respond to movements designed to produce materials of wars and the construction of gunboats. On February 18, 1862, as the effects of the blockade were clearly felt in the South, there appeared a call to action in the Mobile Register and Advertiser, written by an anonymous lady of Mobile. This lady began her appeal to the patriotism of Southern women by telling the story of a woman so desirous of helping her country that she offered to contribute the small amount of money earned by her needle to the cause of defense. And this small gesture led to the germination of a greater idea, which was strengthened by the offer of another anonymous and public-spirited lady. I quote, "I propose to be one of the women of the South to aid in building another gunboat for the defense of our city. I will contribute the sum of $250 and feel assured that every mother will consider it a privilege to help the noble cause." Our original lady of Mobile responded in turn by asking to hear from, quote, "town and country, from village and hamlet, mountain and plain of our great state. We call upon the women of the interior to take the matter in hand in every town and neighborhood and county. The cause is a noble one, the effort is sublime. If the women take it up with a will, there is no such word as fail." And so the Women's Gunboat Fund was born for the specific purpose of raising funds to build a boat, quote, "for the defense of our Alabama coast." And because they wanted this effort to be independent of men, women called upon their fellow women to help raise funds so that the vessel would truly be, quote, "a monument to the history, zeal, and devotion of the women of Alabama." A week later, on February 26, 1862, the weekly Montgomery Advertiser printed a similar appeal. "We commend it to our noble women who have already done so much to clothe our brave troops with wool and to soothe and tend them when sick. The women of the South wield an influence in the struggle for her independence, which is impossible to estimate. They should exert it." Now, Alabama wasn't the only state to organize a gunboat fund. Other Southern states saw women organizing societies likewise designed to raise money to construct gunboats. The first of these was organized in New Orleans in 1861 by women who were upset over the capture by the North of Port Royal in South Carolina. In November of that year, the first gunboat fair was held, and it's likely that the idea spread from there into Alabama. On March 1st, 1862, the Charleston Daily Courier printed a letter from an anonymous lady in Summerville, South Carolina. Go to my next slide, of women with the wares that they wanted to sell. And this lady in Somerville, South Carolina, suggested that individuals contribute to a gunboat fund. And one South Carolina woman noted in her diary that she had donated a pearl necklace to a gunboat fair that raised in total around $2,000. On March 14, 1862, the Georgia Daily Inquirer proposed that Georgia women follow ladies in South Carolina in pursuit of a gunboat. At the same time, inspired by women in South Carolina and Georgia, the Richmond Daily Dispatch in Virginia appealed for funds to buy a gunboat. Shortly thereafter, the women of Richmond formed the Ladies' Defense Association of Richmond expressly for this purpose. According to the book, Women of the Confederacy, quote, we can but inadequately represent the energy with which the women of Virginia undertook this work or the sacrifices which they made to complete it. That their jewels and their household plate, heirlooms, in many instances that have been handed down from generation to generation, and were the embodiments of ancestral rank and tradition, were freely given up, is known. And these groups were very competitive, jostling to see which group could raise the most money. Indeed, the Alabama Beacon reported on March 21st, 1862, we would state that the women of Georgia and South Carolina are also engaged in the same noble work. And unless the women of Alabama bestir themselves, their sisters will snatch from them the honor of having the first of the women's gunboats built and ready for service. So gunboats were expensive back then. They cost about $80,000. And most of these ladies' organizations were ultimately not able to raise enough money to purchase a gunboat. But the effort that they put into it was really overwhelming. A reading of Alabama papers from the period, which is a fun exercise in its own right, but it reveals a delightful series of regular reports that chart the progress of the Women's Gunboat Fund. It's kind of like there was a conversation going on through these newspapers. That's how people communicated to each other back then through these. And so we see a number of reports of how this fund was progressing, which I'm sure many, many people were interested in. Individuals donated both small and larger sums of money, but also objects that could be sold or raffled off to raise funds. Brass, silver, maps, jewelry, other fancy articles, many of which were family heirlooms that then never reached later generations. One woman even sent several bottles of wine, writing to the editors of the newspaper, I ship you the wine for the ladies' gunboat by the steamer Vivian. You will find 78 large bottles and 56 small bottles. 12 of the small are sent by my little daughter, 9 years old, who was so anxious to contribute something that I send it for her. Another generous patron sent 73 pounds of butter to sell, with all the proceeds going to the women's gunboat. And yet another donated her sewing machine, writing, get my next slide, writing, I have no money nor valuables, my only treasures being my children, and I cannot offer them to my country, for they are daughters. I have a sewing machine, though, which I offer to be disposed of for the benefit of the fund. And this woman received the following reply from the editors of the newspaper. This patriotic offer affords another proof of the deep hold our case has taken upon the affections of our noble women. We advise our correspondent to hold on to her sewing machine for the present. Of course, a sewing machine was a pretty valuable object for a woman in those days, as they were engaged in so much sewing for the family and repair. That was quite an offer. One little girl named Sally Nichols of Summerfield gave half of her $10 annual allowance toward the cost of construction. The list of donors also included an enslaved woman named Leanthea, whose contribution of only $1 constituted her only cash holdings. On April 7th, 1862, the Mobile Evening News reported from a Lauderdale Station, Mississippi man, "Allow me to state that my wife is anxious to contribute something towards building the contemplated gunboat for the defense of Mobile, and has concluded to send down the leaden pipe of our pump, which weighs about 60 pounds, to be sold to the Confederacy, and the proceeds applied to the ladies' gunboat. We have a little rope yet that will answer for wells, and should that fail, we have a natural growth that can be found in every part of our glorious Confederacy. The grapevine feature. It answers as a very good substitute for the hemp rope in baling cotton, and should the blockade continue a great while longer, it will cause us to be the most independent people on earth. The great trouble is the blockade may soon be raised, and then we may not realize the benefit that we abound from our own resources. I am, with great respect, a friend for our holy cause, and my wife for the gunboat." Of course, the blockade was really the downfall of the South at that point. One little girl wrote, "One of my uncles gave me $5, and I had rather give it for the gunboat to keep the mean old Yankees off than buy anything with it. Because you see, if the Yankees get here, they will take everything away from us. I hope you will tell all the other little girls to give their money the same way, and then I think we will soon have a gunboat. Your little friend, Clara J. Anderson." By mid-April of that year, the Mobile Register and Advertiser reported a total of $2,246 raised for the Alabama Women's Gunboat Fund, and they expected another couple thousand to come in. As no sacrifice seemed too great, many women began making quilts to donate to the numerous raffles and bazaars that were planned. According to newspapers, between March and May of 1862, at least 6 quilts made by Alabama women were donated to the Women's Gunboat Fund. First, on March 30th, 1862, a woman named M.D. Reeser from Whistler, Alabama, wrote to the Mobile Register and Advertiser, "This unholy war has bereaved me of my husband, leaving myself and little son dependent upon my father, who is in very limited circumstances. I have no money, and I wish to contribute something to the ladies' gunboat. So if you will dispose of this quilt as you see proper for the gunboat, you will oblige me." Next, it was reported by the same paper on April 19th, 1862, that $108 was raised in Utah, Alabama, from the raffle of a fine silk quilt made by an unidentified lady living in Demopolis. Then, the Alabama Beacon in Greensboro reported on April 25th, 1862, "Two very handsome quilts have been left with Colonel Chadwick to be raffled off, the proceeds to be applied to the Women's Gunboat Fund. One is the handiwork of ladies residing in the Havana neighborhood, and the other was made by Miss Josephine Bayall." Now, unfortunately, the whereabouts of these 4 quilts is currently unknown, and we have no further details about really what happened to them or what they look like. However, 2 quilts mentioned in the Alabama Beacon are now in the collections of the Birmingham Museum of Art and the First White House of the Confederacy in Montgomery. And their fascinating story was recorded in the newspaper on April 4th, or beginning on April 4th, 1862. And here's just it's just a printout from that newspaper that I was able to find online. And it reads, "A widow with an asterisk of our town of Greensboro, who has 2 sons in the army, has made 2 quilts of most rare and beautiful workmanship, the proceeds from the sale of which she proposes to devote to the building of the gunboat. One of the quilts was placed in my charge on my visit to Marion, Perry County, on Thursday last, At a public meeting there, I offered the same for sale to the highest bidder. It was bid off for the sum of $100. The money was immediately contributed by the persons present, and the quilt replaced in my hands to be resold for the same patriotic object. Yours respectfully, J Hutchinson, Greensboro, March 22nd, 1862. And then we see a note at the bottom from the editors saying, the lady referred to is Mrs. Hatter. That quilt or the other contributed by her has been sold in Tuscaloosa for $500. And keeping in mind that, without the internet or any other, picking up the phone, that to get news to the newspaper would take a few days. So we see the note written by Mr. Hutchinson on March 22nd and then printed a week or so later in the newspaper with the note from the editor. And now J Hutchinson was Joseph Johnston Hutchinson, and he was a Methodist minister in Summerfield, Alabama. And he seems to have been very involved in the selling and reselling of these two quilts. As I mentioned, many of these fairs were run by churches or took place on church grounds, and many churches were involved. And it's really thanks to J Hutchinson that we know the story of this quilt, or of the two quilts that I'll mention in a moment. So 1 week later, Hutchinson reported in the paper, you notice the sale of a quilt at Marion made and presented by a lady of Greensboro as a contribution to the Ladies' Gunboat Fund. The quilt being returned to me with a request to sell it again for the same patriotic object. It was bought by a gentleman of Tuscaloosa for $100, thus making $200 realized from the sale of this quilt for the Gunboat enterprise. I have the pleasure to state the same lady has placed in my hands another quilt of still richer workmanship devoted to the same object. This second donation I offered for sale in Tuscaloosa last week. It was first bought by the contributions of several citizens for $115, who directed me to sell it to a larger company I expected to address in the same place that day and devote the proceeds of the sale to providing for the families of absent soldiers. At the second sale in this city, the sum of $500 was realized and the quilt again presented to the Gunboat enterprise. Last night at Summerfield in your county, I offered the quilt for sale again in pursuance of directions when the sum of $250 was bid for the same, and the quilt devoted to the raising of aid to the deserted farms and families of soldiers in the more northern and poorer sections of the state. The sale for that object is expected to come off in Selma tomorrow, 3rd of April. Yours, J Hutchinson, April 2nd, 1862. So in short, Mrs. Hatter of Greensboro made and offered two quilts for sale with the proceeds going to the Gunboat Fund. So who was Mrs. Hatter? Unfortunately, I don't have any images of her or anything remotely about, any images of where she lived or her family. But she was Martha Jane Dixon Hatter Bullock. Martha Jane was born about 1815 and was first married to Richard B. Hatter in 1832. The couple lived on a plantation outside of Greensboro, and they did have two sons, Robert Allen Hatter and James Dixon Hatter, born in 1837, and who fought in the 54th Alabama Regiment during the Civil War. Richard Hatter, the husband, died on February 14, 1849, leaving his wife a pretty well-off widow. Her second marriage occurred 14 years later in 1863 to Colonel William Henley Bullock, who was born about 1797 and who also owned a large plantation in the Greensboro area. By all accounts, Martha Jane was an exceptional seamstress. So the first of these now famous quilts Excuse me, there we go. He's now at the Birmingham Museum of Art, and we're looking at that on our screen. So this quilt was sold in Marion and Tuscaloosa for $100 at each sale. And the second quilt donated by Mrs. Hatter, which is indeed much fancier, is now housed in this beautiful building in Montgomery, the first White House of the Confederacy. And here we have an image of that quilt. And this quilt was sold a total of 4 times, twice in Tuscaloosa for $115 and $500, in Summerfield for $250, and then again in Selma, as Hutchinson reported, of course, prior to the sale. And we don't know the price that it sold for in Selma. So the Birmingham quilt, let's look at it again. It descended in the Hatter family, together with the information that it was made by Martha Jane Hatter, and that both quilts were sold to support the Gunboat Fund. According to family tradition, the quilt was purchased second, so the second time it was sold, by a wealthy Texan, he must have been in Tuscaloosa at that time, who then gave it back to Mrs. Hatter. Mrs. Hatter then decided that she would honor her mother, who was Eleanor Singleton Dixon, by keeping the quilt to be passed down to all future Eleanors in the family. And so from Mrs. Hatter, it descended to Eleanor Singleton Hatter, and then to Eleanor Wesley Weinberg Strickland. And the museum purchased the quilt from Mrs. Strickland in 1985, and it's from her that we received a lot of the family information. This second, and admittedly a much fancier quilt, was a 1928 gift to the first White House of the Confederacy by Mary Hutchinson Jones. Mrs. Jones was the granddaughter of J Hutchinson. And this quilt was then included in an exhibition in Dallas, Texas, at the headquarters of Sterling Price Camp of the United Confederate Veterans in the fall of 1899. And there were numerous reports in newspapers, both in Dallas and in Alabama, about this. And the Montgomery Advertiser included an article and described the quilt as, quote, an interesting war relic, and goes on to say, made by Mrs. Hatter, a widow of Greensboro, Alabama, whose husband had been killed in the war, and we know that's not true, he died in 1849, and who had at the time 2 sons fighting in the Confederate Army. That was true. Mrs. Hatter gave the quilt to be sold at auction in every town in Alabama, sort of true, to raise a fund with which to build a gunboat to be named for the state. And then the article goes on, and this I think is interesting for the provenance of this quilt. The quilt was finally given to J Hutchinson of Greensboro, Alabama, to recompense him for his services as auctioneer, and it has remained in his family ever since. So that makes sense. That's how it came into Mary Hutchinson Jones' possession, and how she was able to give it to the White House of the Confederacy. But despite these enthusiastic efforts, the Women's Gunboat Fund failed for lack of money. In the spring of 1862, when enthusiasm for women's gunboat societies was at its peak, the Confederate Navy suffered a series of disasters that quelled public enthusiasm for the project and led to a decline in contributions. In late April 1862, New Orleans fell, as did then Memphis and Norfolk, and almost all of the Confederacy's existing gunboats were destroyed in the process. No longer could Alabamians cling to the belief that a gunboat in the harbor would protect Mobile. 2 months after the first appeal to Alabama women went out, less than $3,000 had been raised for the gunboat. Remember, it cost $80,000 roughly. And in May of the same year, the Alabama Beacon and the Selma Reporter both reported the likelihood that the city of Mobile would fall into the hands of the enemy, and they suggested that the project to build a gunboat for the defense of the state be abandoned or postponed. They furthermore proposed that all funds raised for the gunboat be used instead for hospitals and for providing for the sick and wounded, writing, "In view of the probability that Mobile will fall into the hands of the enemy, and the project for building the women's gunboat for the defense of the state will either be abandoned or indefinitely postponed, it has been proposed that the gunboat fund be applied in providing hospitals and in procuring hospital stores for the use of the sick and wounded in our armies." Thus, the Women's Gunboat Fund came to an end only months after it had started. So let's look at the Birmingham quilt again. The Birmingham quilt is 66 inches square, really too small to be a bed quilt, and it was likely made instead as a decorative piece to showcase Mrs. Hatter's needlework skills. And it's not assumed that she made this specifically for the gunboat fund. It's more likely, I think, that this was a quilt in her possession that she had made previously and that she decided to then donate this in the other quilt. I think the timing otherwise probably doesn't kind of mesh with the extent or when the quilts were offered to J Hutchinson. So in the center, we see an embroidered basket of applique flowers surrounded by an embroidered floral wreath. And these applique flowers are all made of individual pieces of fabric, stuffed and embroidered, and then attached to the surface of the quilt. The framed central motif is applied to a background of silk taffeta in an unusual shade of brown. Small blue taffeta squares line up to frame the central design. And in the corners of the quilt are 4 additional floral bouquets, also stuffed and embellished with embroidery. And we just recently, I'm excited to say, had this quilt professionally conserved by Howard Sutcliffe. You may be familiar with him. And it's currently on view in the museum, although it will be coming down very soon and will then rest for a while before we're able to show it again. It's a very delicate piece and we don't want to overuse it. We really want to maintain it for posterity. And the other quilt here in Montgomery is larger. It's actually 71 by 68 inches. And it's constructed with the same wool chalice used on the Birmingham quilt. And it includes 21 stuffed and embroidered floral sprays around the edge. The center shows a similar large floral bouquet, heavily stuffed and embroidered, and with 4 three-dimensional stuffed strawberries, a variety of birds and butterflies. These flowers and the wreath of flowers surrounding the central bouquet were cut from the same fabric used on the border. And scholars have determined that both quilts were made by the same hand. Now, there's been a little controversy surrounding the maker of these 2 gunboat quilts. And this stems from the fact that Martha Jane Hatter's second husband, William Henry Bullock, had first been married to a noted needlewoman in her own right named Panthea Burchett Bullock. So William and Panthea lived together at his plantation in Greene County until she died in 1860. Shortly thereafter, William began courting Martha Jane Hatter, who again was a fairly wealthy widow and who had been widowed for about 14 years by this time. And the couple then eventually married in 1863. And so in doing, preparing for this presentation, we have a very thick file here in the museum, and I went through it extensively to kind of get all of the information. There's just a lot of related information in the file. So with regard to, I read the story about the two makers, and my colleague, Dr. Graham Butcher, who at the time was curator of American art at the museum, he's now our director, and he has been in that position for about 3.5 years. But in 2014, he conducted research on the quilt. The question had come up in 2014 as well. And so he did extensive research, as he does, And based on his finding, he did conclude that the Birmingham quilt, and by extension, the Montgomery quilt, was indeed made by Martha Jane Dixon Hatter. And it was given to her by given by her to the Alabama gunboat cause, which fortunately, through these fascinating newspaper stories and through the quilts themselves, we have been able to recreate the story, and it's well documented for us today, and that's very exciting. So thank you. That concludes my presentation, but I'm very happy to answer any questions about it.
Great, thank you. We really appreciate that. I wanted to tell our viewers that this has been recorded. And so you actually will send a link to the, we'll clean it up a little bit. You will actually, in the next couple of days, you'll receive a link so that you'll be able to, rewatch, concentrate on it a little bit and share it as well. It's also going out to several organizations, quilt historians in the South that have, I see a few of you have popped up and are viewing us today as well. So you'll be able to also view this as well as our other decorative art symposium presentations on our landmarksfoundation.com website, going into our decorative arts exhibit area there as well. So thank you very much. We appreciate today's presentation, and I want to remind you that next week, Thursday morning at 10 o'clock, our presenter will be Michael McCurchin, who will be talking about seeing double stereoptic views of Alabama. Be very interesting. We hope to see you all back Thursday morning at 10 o'clock, and you will receive the Zoom link just like you did this morning to visit that with us that day and see that presentation as well. But thank you.